does systems confrontation look like for a battalion? Well, it might not be that you see a joint firepower strike being conducted and there's a DF-17 hypersonic missile and it's coming really fast. It might be there's an explosion. We don't know where it came from. We don't know what it was because they paralyzed our ability to assess and interpret that. So that's what system confrontation, if they do everything they want to be able to do, that's what it means.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Tactics and Operations Podcast. I'm your host, Major Josh White, here at McTog in 29 Palms. I got a great episode lined up today. But before we get into that, I want to put a pitch out there for anyone that has any content or they want to be on the podcast themselves. Just simply email me at tacticsandoperationspodcast@gmail.com. That's tacticsandoperationspodcast@gmail.com. For anything, if you feel like you have had an experience that fits within our content, whether it's a school you've gone to here or a slice of the, or if you feel like you have a certain subject matter expertise on something that would do well on this podcast, let me know. We'd love to have you. Whether we can do it remotely as well. You don't have to come to 29 Palms to do that. All right. So first, I want to say that the opinions on this podcast are that of the participants only. They don't reflect the stance of McTog or the Marine Corps or MCAC 29 Palms, and are that of the individuals only. All right, with that, I want to introduce our guest today, Chief Warrant Officer 3, Frank Chisowski. He's on staff here at McTog in the Intel shop, but he dabbles in a lot, and he has a lot of knowledge about a lot of things, and we rely heavily on him in all of our courses, specifically when it comes to intelligence-related activities, although I wouldn't corner him in that genre either. So, Frank, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, what you did before you came to McTog, and what we're going to talk about today.
Hey, thanks, Major White. So my name's Frank Chisowski, as I mentioned before, Chief Warrant Officer, United States Marine Corps. I've been doing this for about 20 years now. Throughout my career, I've had various tours in places like squadrons, battalions, like 2nd Recon Battalion, worked at Marine Division. I'm a prior 0311. My most recent tour before coming to Marine Corps Tactics and Operations Group was I worked for the China Research Group, as well as Executive Support Branch at Headquarters Marine Corps, briefing the Commandant and the Secretary of the Navy. So that all started probably back in about 2020, 2019 timeframe. And around that time is when we started to see a shift, particularly in how we looked at China as a threat. And one of the things that I noticed around that time was there were a lot of people that still genuinely believed that China was going to engage in like these human wave attacks, or that they fought just like Russia did. That shifted probably most in 2020 timeframe. And even though we've been talking about a pivot to the Pacific for a long time, I think it's really only recently that a lot of people really care about what China's doing, and specifically the People's Liberation Army's approach to warfare. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about today is something that I learned about for the first time back in 2018 when RAND published a study on systems confrontation as part of a larger approach to what you can consider to be maneuver warfare with Chinese characteristics. And that's something I was hoping to talk to you about today.
Okay, yeah, so when you do a quick Google search of this particular subject or anything related to this subject, a million articles will pop up about the Chinese way of war or systems destruction, systematic destruction, or any variation of those terms. But is it accurate to say, I guess what we're going to talk about today is the Chinese perspective of how they see war, and then how we view their viewpoint of war? Because anything we do is our best guess. We don't know exactly what they're after. We have plenty of smart people that have a lot of knowledge on this subject. And again, they're providing their best guess, their best interpretation of how they think China views war, and how they're establishing their systems, establishing their military to exploit those viewpoints. So is that accurate to say we're going to delve into the Chinese perspective of war?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, just to put my own spin on your question, you're basically asking is like, how do we know as much as we think we know, and also how do we reach the conclusions that we've drawn, right? Well, the fact is even though we've only recently started to care about China, we've been watching them for a long time. And to be honest, a lot of people think a lot of what we know now all comes from the 2015 timeframe when they did their reforms. But they also, that's not necessarily an exclusive fact, because at the end of the day, we've also seen a seminal moment after Desert Storm Desert Shield. But even before that, in the 1980s, the 1985 specifically, we've seen them try to downsize their force. And if you go even further back than that, back in 1949, after they won their civil war and became basically the single party government, the Chinese Communist Party took control of China, we have to take into account the fact that this was a guerrilla army, a liberation army, literally, that won that civil war. And so there's a lot of things that I think make the People's Liberation Army unique. And what's also unique is they knew that they had to step things up, because when they saw Desert Storm, Desert Shield, they knew that their military was severely inferior to what Saddam Hussein even brought to the fight. They would have been much more comfortable bringing a gardening tool to the battlefield than they would an actual weapon, because they were still very much involved in the industrialization and even just the agricultural industries of the country. So the way that they tried to address that gap mostly was from reading our doctrine, from reading what we were writing. And so you're going to see a lot of things in what they say they're going to do that sound awfully familiar to what we said we were going to do back then. So things like systems come up a lot. Systems confrontation, systems destruction are really outgrowths of things that we wrote about quite a bit in the 1980s and the 1990s.
So would you say that although Desert Storm wasn't the singular moment where they began to shift their entire defense system, that it was the most impactful in the way that they saw how the U.S. systematically destroyed the Iraqi regime, and not necessarily through annihilation, but in a period of, I think it was 72 hours, and strategic bombing and strikes that ultimately just dismantled the conventional part of the Iraqi army almost immediately. Now there was an annihilation follow-on, on the highway of death, but is it accurate to say that, although not the singular most important, probably pivotal moment?
No, I'd say that actually is a fair characterization. I think that was one of the most, if not the most important shifting moment. We saw a lot of changes happen after Desert Storm, Desert Shield. A lot of people talk about Colonels Wang and Chow writing specifically from the National Defense University at the time about unrestricted warfare. For example, there's some really good books out there specifically talking about that, War Without Limits by General Spalding, retired. There's a lot of great literature about that, but I think some of the things that fly under most people's radar are some of the other shifts that happened. For example, after that, they actually introduced a rank structure for officers soon afterwards. So up until that point, they were still kind of operating under the Maoist ideology that, you don't want to stratify human beings by awarding them rank. And then another 10 years later, you start to see enlisted ranks in like 1999. You also start to see them start to talk a lot more about how do we change from this idea of the People's War, which you could argue was basically just mysticism, towards informationatization, right? And that's one of the first things that you start to see a lot start to crop up in the 1990s. It's this idea, and there's really no good translation for this, but informatization, informationization, regardless of how you translate it, it's this idea that information is pivotal to any warfighting system. So
as I was preparing for this and doing some readings and relying on some readings I've done in the past, I keep coming to the realization, I think, that it's not necessarily new. Nothing in this is new. It's not a groundbreaking revelation on warfare as far as how we think the Chinese see warfare. It does mirror, if we're talking about systems confrontation and systematically disrupting an enemy system in order to exploit a specific characteristic to slow the overall system down while avoiding surfaces and hardened weapon systems or hardened nodes of that system, sounds a lot like maneuver warfare. So as I go into my reading, I can't help but think it, pun intended, that it's like the Wish.com or Temu version of maneuver warfare. Take that how you will, but not to underestimate it, but I think there's some characteristics that give us an avenue to counter it, which we'll get into later.
Yeah, I don't actually disagree with that characterization, as amusing as it is, because but at the same time, I don't know that I necessarily see it as an inferior version, the way that might imply, right? We jokingly say it a lot here at McTalk, but anytime you think you're bigger and smarter than your enemy, you're halfway to the little bighorn, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's, I think, an interesting way of thinking about it. There's this idea in science called emergent complexity, right? It's this idea that systems kind of emerge and are something different than their constituent parts, right? They can become more. A school of fish behaves inherently differently than individual fish. They think, very much in accordance with this very scientific concept, that something can be more than the sum of its parts, or if you hit it correctly, it can become less than the sum of its parts. And I've talked to generals and headquarters Marine Corps that have acknowledged this point, that specifically, small doesn't beat big unless it's interconnected, interwoven, and part of a larger system, right? So we acknowledge this, and that's actually where the differences start to come up, right? Even though we talk about critical vulnerabilities and surfaces and gaps in MCDP1 or wherever else, what they think about it in terms of is how, and if you read the RAND study that came out in 2018, I mentioned before, they talk about first and foremost going after the flow of information. That's the hallmark of systems confrontation. Beyond that, they want to go after critical systems, then they want to go after architecture, and they want to do all this to try to go after tempo. In a way, I'd say it's actually more maneuverous than what we do in the Marine Corps, because when we in the Marine Corps talk about it, we're talking about the doer. What is the center of gravity, the thing that achieves it? So whereas when we do center of gravity analysis, we might look at, for example, the aircraft carrier is the scariest thing. Well, guess what? They care an awful lot more about things like a TPS-80 Gator radar that can facilitate the flow of information, like maritime domain awareness. And so don't be surprised if their target precedence is radically different than what we would do, and how that might actually create complications that we've never encountered before as a Marine Corps.
Yeah, so a lot of what we're talking about was pulled out of a RAND study from 2018. And the author goes into specifics about the challenges when it comes to interpreting meaning from the Chinese document. He goes from the Chinese sources, interprets them, and then puts it in a study to help defense experts, professionals understand it better. But he does a good job of explaining that it's not simply just translating. There's some deeper discussion that needs to go into the meaning of words, specifically the word system, how we see a system and how they see a system. In some ways, a system is a system, and they talk about a system of systems. And one article I read, there's a million analogies you can have of a system, and we use a lot of them here at Advanced Maneuver Warfare course when we're analyzing the enemy. And one of the best ones I thought was a steam engine. Fairly simple by today's terms, right? You have something that produces heat, coal, and then it boils water, steam, and then that steam is used to propel whatever drivetrain you're trying to drive. Pretty simple, but when you look at a steam engine, it does not look simple, right? There's a million pipes, heat exchangers, heat producers, and any one of those pipes that gets disrupted can throw the entire system into disarray because it's not very redundant. For its time, it was remarkable, but now it's obviously obsolete. There's no redundancy in it, and there's a single pathway of heat, which we could translate to information, as you talked about, can disrupt the whole thing. Now, that brings me back to a discussion that almost pops up every podcast: our definition of maneuver warfare and how we get after that in Advanced Maneuver Warfare course. And some of the verbiage in MCDP 1 says to shatter the enemy's cohesion. Yeah. I don't know. I go back and forth. I understand the intent of that. I understand the picture that puts in your mind and the violence that it kind of can perpetrate, which is great. But also, I think if left analyzed beyond the surface level, sometimes I think people think that leads to what I call the Death Star kind of complex, where if we're analyzing an enemy system and we get an X-wing fighter into the tailpipe of the Death Star, the whole thing crumbles and it cannot recoup, which we know is not true. The enemy system adapts, it will change, it will heal its wound and find a different way. If it's adaptable. I think that brings out a conflict that I see with the Chinese view. I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, that it's very science heavy. It's very technologically based, which goes into direct conflict of maybe a Clausewitzian form of war where, yes, technology, the science of it is important, but there's a proper balance of art and the human will and uncertainty and friction that Clausewitz kind of alludes to the fact that we need more out of that. We need our commanders to focus on that more, less on the science of it. Is that a potential vulnerability in the Chinese viewpoint of systems confrontation?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, right? It's interesting. I've read a lot of Chinese doctrine, and I've also read a lot of American doctrine. I've never seen a mathematical formula in an American doctrine, but I've yet to find a Chinese doctrine that doesn't have a mathematical formula in it.
Interesting.
They believe that there is a science of tactics. They actually have a publication called The Science of Tactics. They have The Science of Military Strategy, which is probably the closest thing they have to a national defense strategy. And this is one of the documents that kind of outlines a lot of things. There's actually a Cassie study that you can find on the internet that kind of breaks down in their own words, like what do they say they want to be able to do as a military strategy. Well, when you read this, what you find is they believe that they can mathematically anticipate and they can figure out what they think we are most likely to do. And that is going to be what causes them to use a certain type of resource, a certain type of weapon system. And then when there is more uncertainty, they mathematically try to reduce the threat that poses by just leveraging more resources against it. It's actually one of the reasons why the Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations concept actually could potentially be as deterrent as we hope it will be. Because at the end of the day, how do you confuse a mathematician? You increase the number of variables. And the Expeditionary Advanced Base is nothing if it's not a whole bunch of variables for them to have to figure out. They'll have to hedge. They'll have to allocate more missiles. And at some point, the cost imposition goes back on the Chinese. And I don't mean to be dismissive of this mathematical approach, because if they have the war that I think they want to have, if you read about their ideas called like effective control, for example, they want to have a short, sharp conflict that they begin under favorable conditions and terminate on favorable terms. And if that's the war that they want, if they can anticipate potentially just 1, 2, 3 moves into that game, I think they might actually be able to do that. And that might actually be the kind of thing that they need. Because if you look at how the home field advantage is going to work, say, for example, in a Taiwan contingency, and I think that mathematical approach has merits, it just might have some disadvantages as well. For example, I think they might be overconfident in their ability to anticipate the reaction of an enemy system. And as that conflict goes on, I think what you're going to find is that the way that we do maneuver warfare, for example, small unit leadership, initiative-based tactics, and empowering our NCOs to actually make decisions with commander's intent, I think that's going to create a lot of problems for a system that tries to exert a lot of control over their system.
Yeah, so at MCTOG, we have the opportunity to see a lot of units come through service level training exercises out here at McCaxey. During MWX, MACTAF warfighting exercise, and AFX, the adversary side to that. We even go up to Bridgeport to see those units fight there as well. A large part of those exercises is figuring out our command and control in a way that still facilitates rapid decision-making from the commander, but reduces its targetability and its impact if it is targeted. And every unit addresses this in some way or another. Some units are more successful than others, but I would like to think that all of them grow while they're here doing that and improve leading here. Are those efforts the right efforts we should be getting after to defend against this, or should we be focusing the efforts somewhere else?
I think one of the things that we need to focus on specifically is figuring out how do we actually use what we have and not be so reliant on our systems. Because one of the things that they assess, and I think correctly so, is that they can potentially achieve information dominance simply by trying to paralyze our individual systems, prevent us from being able to communicate, sow deception in order to paralyze our command and control system so that they can fall upon those individual components and defeat them in detail. Or better still, and this kind of is very Sun Tzu in nature, they won't have to have that fight in the first place. Keep in mind what all this is for. For example, if they were to try to do a quote-unquote forceful unification with Taiwan, they don't necessarily need to be able to defeat us. They need to counter our intervention, which means they want to paralyze that system, ergo preventing us, precluding us from being able to participate in the conflict.
Creating a fait accompli.
Absolutely. They want to be able to do that. Now, that's very different than the approach that we as Marines have that we're trying to replicate, for example, in an MWX here in McCagsey, right? What we're trying to do is figure out, how do we stay on the offense? How do we defeat this enemy system? Another thing that the tentative manual for Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations really gets after that I think is very important is, how do we prevent that fait accompli? Well, maybe that requires us to have more faces and places and maybe more bases, right?
Yeah.
That is the hallmark of it. And it gets a lot of flack. Obviously, Chatter 2 brings up some really significant sources of potential concern. But I also personally believe that, a T-Rex with longer arms wouldn't have survived the Ice Age. We can't just do evolutionary changes. We need to make revolutionary changes, because the threat environment that China is going to present us with, particularly in the Western Pacific, is going to be radically different than anything we face in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's not just in the Western Pacific either, because as we've seen with any other conflict we've ever been in, the rest of the world is watching. And if they figure out what is the secret sauce of China's success in the Western Pacific, they might be able to replicate those circumstances for us elsewhere in the world.
So this viewpoint, from the Chinese perspective, I would say it's operational at the lowest, definitely strategic, but it doesn't really get into the tactical level, I don't think. So how does this systems destruction, systems confrontation, how does it translate to the tactical level, which is what we deal with here at AMWIC a lot, and we talk about their tactics, their brigade and battalion level tactics, and how they're going to implement their assets, we think.
Yeah.
But how does the system confrontation kind of feed into the tactical level?
I think it precipitates certain decisions. And for example, you could make the case that it's operational in nature, but it informs their force design. And their force design informs what capabilities they have. Mm. What capabilities they have, basically, as we like to say in intelligence, sets the limits of expectations. So in a manner of speaking, I think it does. What does systems confrontation look like for a battalion? Well, it might not be that you see a joint firepower strike being conducted and there's a DF-17 hypersonic missile and it's coming really fast. It might be there's an explosion. We don't know where it came from. We don't know what it was, because they paralyzed our ability to assess and interpret that. So that's what system confrontation, if they do everything they want to be able to do, that's what it means. And in conjunction with that, like I said, flow of information. They might use that against us potentially as well. So for example, one of the things I talk about when I teach Chinese tactics at the Advanced Maneuver Warfare course is I talk about how if you're not doing deception, you're not doing Chinese tactics. And deception can take a variety of different forms. What we would refer to as tactical deception, it could be a feint, it could be a demonstration, but I think it also could be, what are they doing to creatively use the systems they have to misdirect our attention? Because I think we use things like tactical deception, military deception, and possibly even some type of information warfighting function to try to confuse or paralyze an enemy system, but we only do that after we've come up with the operational maneuver. I think the Chinese People's Liberation Army rightfully assesses that pound for pound, their individual troop isn't as good as, for example, a U.S. Marine that comes through our doors at the Advanced Maneuver Warfare course. What they think they can do to kind of level that playing field, even though we've made enormous investments in individual Marines and we're spectacularly trained and we're physically fit, smart, at the end of the day, what they think they can do, though, is go after what's going on between your ears. If I can confuse you, if I can create doubt, that is going to be the thing that creates conditions where their overwhelming use of resources, where that scientific approach to tactics starts to actually have a decisive advantage. Mm. And so to kind of give you an example of how we replicate that, when we do one of our scenarios, Spartan Dawn specifically, what I do is I try to present a situation where a Chinese Combined Arms Brigade is attacking a regimental landing team. And what I do is I have told them the Chinese will use deception. And I find that Marines who are subjected to that scenario second guess every single advancing element. Every battalion, every company, they think that one might be the feint. And sometimes that creates analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
And so that's what systems confrontation, I think, looks like, is how do I make that command and control that you talked about a moment ago work against you?
Man, I got a lot of that created a lot of different thoughts that I want to address most of them. Deception. So that's something we talk about a lot at AMWIC, but we rarely do effectively, I would say. It's like you mentioned, it's sometimes an afterthought, like, let's sprinkle some deception on it. One of the one of the mantras we use here is the see, think, do model, or the do, think, see, however you really see it. But it helps to frame it, to provide some intentionality behind your deception. What do you want the enemy to see? What thought do you want that observation to provoke or create? And from that thought, what action do you want them to do? Or inaction, I would argue, also is something, an intention of deception. But with that, and I think we're getting better at it, with that, when it's being done to you, or the potential, that the potential is there for it to be done to you, both at MWX, and I would say even more in a real training environment beyond a map, a TDG, it seems almost always there's somebody in the planning staff that says, nope, this is the feint.
Yeah.
This is the feint. I know that you know that I know that you know. You're going to try. I know this guy. He's a crafty guy. He's going to do a feint, and we're looking for the main attack.
The classic dilemma, yeah.
And they keep looking for the main attack until like someone's in their COC killing them all. And you're like, oh, no, just kidding. That wasn't the feint. That was the main attack. And I don't know a way around that other than good training, which is really the thing that I kept thinking about as you were saying that, and how we train our Marines, how we train ourselves, and how we say we train, how we want to train, and how we actually train when it comes to the amount of risk and the amount of lower level decisions we allow to, I guess, reduce the value of disrupting our C2, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's a few ways to kind of think about that, I think. For one, I think we need to decrease our reliance on like lateral and vertical communication, right? Like I've been in Afghanistan just like, you have and a lot of us here at McTog. And I remember we were guilty of, hey, the comms are working, right? Let's not touch it. Leave them alone. They're like, just let them work. But at the end of the day, like we're going to have to be agile in Spectrum because they're going to do everything they can to disrupt that. And we're seeing a lot of that firsthand in Ukraine in the conflict with Russia. Electromagnetic spectrum is incredibly congested, incredibly contested, and they're doing everything they can to prevent the command and control that we've historically enjoyed from doing what it historically has done for us. So we're going to have to probably get less reliant on having that command and control relationship that we had during Afghanistan and Iraq. And, what does that mean? Well, that means that we need to change the way we approach training, for example. I think for the listeners that are in battalions or regiments, we oftentimes will hear ourselves say things like, hey, good initiative, bad judgment, with, glancing appreciation for their initiative and basically bludgeoning them for having terrible judgment. And it's basically just a fancy way of saying, like, you idiot, like, what are you thinking about? But at the end of the day, we need to relish and appreciate that, because I think that's the biggest counter that we have for systems confrontation is that low-level leadership. It doesn't take the battalion COC to identify the feint. It takes the guy on the ground to make the call that, hey, these guys aren't necessarily doing the attack that I thought they were going to do. This might be a feint. And making sure they're educated on the Chinese proclivity to do so. Because here's what I think this actually boils down to is, I think there's a tendency, like we talked about earlier, like if you're looking down over your nose at the Chinese, you might see them withdrawing. And you might think, well, these guys they're not nothing. Like, I thought these guys were going to be tough. We've been talking about the pivot to the Pacific for decades now, and look how easy they were to rebuff. But guess what? That might actually be exactly the thing they want you to think, right? They might be withdrawing, and that was the feint, right? So I think sometimes the units who face what we replicate, and we replicate Chinese tactics the best we can using the ATP, 7TAC 100.3, and a variety of other sources. But at the end of the day, I think sometimes it takes tactical patience. I think it takes empowering the lowest level leader. And I think it takes an appreciation for the fact that some adversaries take this deception thing more seriously than we do. And that is going to cause big problems for the way we do maneuver warfare.
Yeah, so when I think about training at the battalion level, so training is easy. Mm-hmm. Good training is hard.
Yeah,
you can go out and train, but if there's not intentionality behind it, and there's not a proper mix of art and science related objectives, then you're probably not squeezing everything out of the train that you can. I had a mentor of mine always say, like, we're training. It's our decision whether it's negative training or positive training, because you're always training. Yeah. Going out and halfway doing something and not training like we fight, or setting up a range where it's just a conveyor belt approach to training. Get up,
Yeah.
get your ammo, clear your line, get on the line, and then start your scenario.
Yeah.
That's setting up a whole lot of bad habits when it comes to disruption of C2. Just a basic squad level live fire range. There are opportunities to implement some of this decision making, some of this hardening of the system in those, and how do you do that? Well, there's 1,000 different ways you can do it, but I think sometimes we have a tendency to keep those ideas maybe at the battalion level or at the company level leadership, and not necessarily empowering our NCOs to come up with those, or to allow them to input into the training, because we have a finite amount of ammo, we have a finite amount of ranges on some bases. It's hard to get ranges, and we surely have a finite amount of time. There's only so much time we have on a team to get good training, and so we don't want to waste that. And so you sometimes I may have found myself saying, I can't afford to push this down to the lowest level and have it fail. But now I'm thinking, with this system, we can't afford not to. We can't afford not to get our NCOs inputted into the training system and get their input into the training system, to allow that decision making, to again reduce the value of that lateral and vertical communication that comes.
Yeah, I think if you're an operations officer, I mean, one of your ideas should be, how do I make myself as dispensable as possible, right? Because I might not have the ability to talk to my folks. What's the difference between good training and bad training? Sometimes it's a matter of perspective, like range 400, we've all done it, we all know it, and to the senior people who have seen it a dozen times, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but to those lower level guys, they're seeing it for the first time. What I think that range 400, for example, doesn't give people an opportunity to do, though, is fail. And I think failure is a critical ingredient in this. I think the difference personally, and this is just my perspective as Frank Chisowski, is the difference between good training and bad training is, did I make a mistake? Did I learn something from that mistake? I think we need to kind of create environments where they have to make decisions. And here's the thing too, is like one of the things that we talk about a lot is training at MCTOG. And we talk about what is the decision that you're going to make. But the problem is that's only half of it. You also have to figure out, when do I need to make this decision, right? We talk about the quality of the decision, but we don't talk about the timeliness of it. And sometimes that's the hardest part, is figuring out, like, I don't have to make this decision right now. I need more information. I need to try to utilize the collection capabilities I have. And as an intelligence professional, selfishly, I feel like it's a necessary plug, is let your guys reduce uncertainty for you. Don't, I think for all its merits, one unfortunate tendency of MWX is because ops understands the enemy unit better than intel, is intel maybe not necessarily able to contribute as much as they normally would. They're using the collection resources they can, but one of the things that I try to teach intelligence tactics instructors is not how Americans fight, but how Russians fight, how Chinese fight. Orient on the enemy. Because one of the other things that I like to say around here is, if you start with the assumption that they're just like us, you're going to fill body bags until you get proven otherwise.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. I'd never really, thought of out here at MWX. It's as good an exercise as we can make it, and it's constantly improving. And there's a ton of smart people behind it that make it so. But at the end of the day, we're fighting Marines, even if we tell them, to fight with certain tactics, which we don't. They get training. But if I'm an OPSO, an infantry battalion, and I'm fighting another guy that I know, we went to EWS together, or command and staff, or we served in another unit. I know him, and so I'm going to orient on him, which is good, which is something we want to get after. But that does leave a gap for the intel guys to be able to reduce uncertainty, because I don't need any uncertainty reduced. I know him, and I know his tendencies to a certain degree. There's never no uncertainty, but I'm wondering how we could adjust it to make a more realistic reliance on intel, which in combat we would be doing. We're gonna maybe we know the enemy commander if we're lucky, but do we really know his tendencies? Do we really know his background? Hopefully, but the ops guys are going to get that. That's going to come from the intel side.
Yeah, and I don't know that it's necessarily a problem we'll be able to solve here at MCTOG. I do think there's utility in having an actual scrimmage. You actually get to see against an actual determined adversary how well my MCON plan, for example, holds up against the interrogation by a robust set of collection capabilities that they brought to bear. So I think there's a lot of utility to that. I don't know that MWX is the best vehicle for gaining an appreciation for a specific adversary, but I think that's one of the things that intelligence tactics instructors that come through the Advanced Maneuver Warfare course should do on behalf of their units. They need to learn as much as they can while they're here, from myself and the Marines that I've been able to educate on how Russia and China fight, and then they need to go back and they need to facilitate training. It's interesting. Sometimes I've had people say to me, because oftentimes, obviously, this, at Kriegspiels, we'll do games where you have to fight against a nominal Russian or Chinese unit. And that actual student has to do the best they can at replicating those Russian or Chinese tactics.
Yeah.
Of course, they want to win, and it's a free play scenario. But at the end of the day, that forces them to put themselves in the shoes of a hypothetical enemy and divorce themselves from the way they would think about this as Marines. And so when we teach Orient on the Adversary here at MCTOG, I talk to them about systems confrontation. I talk about how they're going to try to use deception. I talk to them about some of the history that informs some of the doctrine and some of the training that they receive before they ever step foot in a battlefield. And that's a difficult challenge, but it's one that we, I think, have really stepped up to the plate for as MCTOG, because we allocate 6 hours for just the first class, and then you spend 2 weeks repeatedly fighting against an adversary or fighting as that hypothetical.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's the key. Fighting as the adversary really helps you gain an appreciation for the components of the system, and maybe gaps. Like, I wish I had this particular capability, but I have this capability. And the whole point is to learn threat tactics and threat tendencies, which I think it does, and I think you do a great job of that. So,
and just to bring this back to systems confrontation, I think systems confrontation is a really interesting topic to study, because I think it's one of the things that's really easy to simply assume is similar to the way we do things, right? Yeah. I've had mentors, people who I really respect and admire, tell me, the Chinese fight just like the Russians. I don't know that that's necessarily true. A lot of my mentors, even in the Army, one of the things that is fantastic that the Army does but has its limitations is this idea of this OPFOR composite, the opposing force like composite, which is basically a combination of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and some violent extremist tendencies as well. And they squish it all together under one umbrella. And I think that's really good for a starting point. It's an unclassified adversary. It's a starting point that gets you 50% of the way there for just about anybody who you'd want to fight. There's goodness to that. But I think one of the downsides is it gets you to see the enemies as being similar, even in cases where they might not actually be similar, right? So the approach that we've taken at MCTOG is just different, right? We say 2 weeks you're going to fight Russia, and then we hard transition. Now you're fighting against China. And one of the questions I love to ask students is, if this had been Russia instead of China, how would your tactics have been different? And if the answer is they wouldn't be, you didn't orient on the adversary or the enemy.
Yeah.
You oriented on the terrain. And MCDP1, hate to keep referencing it, but that's something we do a lot here at MCTOG, is orienting the enemy is absolutely critical for the execution of maneuver warfare. So you brought it up earlier. How do we do maneuver warfare? Well, part of that is actually an appreciation for the enemy system and what makes it different. Systems confrontation means that they want to be able to strip away what they believe to be the glue of our operating concept, which is that assured communication. It's space-based capabilities. It's communication. Now, this is one thing that I really respect our operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Fallon, for, because when he was talking about this with the students, a student asked, hey, obviously executing an operation like this takes a lot of comm. And he said, does it take a lot of comm or does it take a lot of C2? And that was an important moment for me, because I realized that moment that those two are not interchangeable. You can do a lot of C2 on the front end by having a good, flexible plan, empowered leadership, a robust set of contingencies, and then just let them do the mission. And then when they do systems confrontation, they do break up our ability to have that assured flow of information. It will have a negligible impact on us. We tend to give these briefs about China and talk about how China's scary. They have all these great new hypersonic missiles. They're going to do systems confrontation. All of that is true. We do need to have a sober appreciation for what China's going to bring to bear and what kind of threat environment they're going to present us with. But we're scary too. And in many ways, I think we're scarier if we appreciate the advantages that we have, because we make enormous investments in individual Marines. It might not seem like it, but we do, especially when you start looking at our adversaries.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's a lot to unpack there. We're gonna run out of time here soon. Maybe we'll have to do a second part. But you did bring up a part of that I do want to do a separate episode on, is the concept of command and control and and how we've, in some ways, bastardized some terms that create a lot of confusion or just complacency when it comes to that. And last question I'll ask you. Within systems confrontation and systems destruction theory and how we've analyzed it, some scholars see that the Chinese view us as over-dependent on our communications, our pathways between those nodes of killing things, the killing assets, and but more importantly, the communications between those. Do you think that's true? And then, if so, how do we get after that? How do we reduce that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because at the end of the day, I think they're not entirely wrong, and I think we tend to really only focus on our own doctrine. I think there's really some goodness to the systems confrontation. Maybe the best thing we can do about it is just return the favor, because what the Chinese talk about it, there's a great book called The Three Faces of the Cyber Dragon that you can find open source on the Foreign Military Studies Office website. But the bottom line is, if we return the favor, they're not going to be able to achieve what they want, which is this quote-unquote information dominance. Because at the end of the day, it requires you to have a robust command and control
and you're talking
of your own.
And you're talking all domains at the same time. Yeah.
And that's part of why China's. Yeah, absolutely it is. And I don't think they're as far along as they'd like to be with their own ability to do command and control, with their own information architecture. That informatization, you could think of it as net-centric warfare, but in a way, information dominance only occurs if you degrade the enemy system, but can still rely on your own, right? And so do you achieve information dominance simply by attacking an enemy system? No, you don't. And so we can create issues for them as well. So they might not be able to level the playing field. I've often said too that, Russia's like a hurricane, but China's like global warming, right? We need to make serious changes, but those serious changes don't necessarily mean we need to invest more in systems or programs of record. It means we need to invest more, personally, in my opinion, in training junior Marines.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's very actionable, right? Do command and control the way you think you need to, and then see how it goes. Don't be a helicopter OIC. Actually let them do the operation and then give them feedback on the back end. You want to try to create a friendly system that is not dependent on you. That's why I said it earlier. Your job should be to make yourself as dispensable as possible.
And that includes failure.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't like that.
No, we don't. Because
makes us look bad.
Exactly, right? And it's so much easier to do it myself, because if I don't do it myself, if I let them do it, I don't know what's going to happen. Well, guess what? There's another word for that. It's called empowerment. That's what empowerment is.
Yeah.
You don't know what's going to happen. And so I'm a big fan of that, because I've had the luxury of a lot of leaders that have empowered me over the years, right? That trusted me and then gave me feedback. Oftentimes when I made a big mistake, they would just say, well, what did we learn?
Yeah.
And I think that's an approach that we as a Marine Corps and as a U.S. military are uniquely situated to be able to adopt. I don't think the Chinese would have an easy time adopting that. And if they don't have their command and control system and we don't have ours, I think at the end of the day, when the coaches are kind of factored out of the equation, it's the players who win the game.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. There's so much there. I think also about leaders in my past that have shown empathy from failure. And those stick out, right? Like, you have success. You had a ton of successes in your career. You probably remember those attaboys way less than you remember those moments of empathy and those commanders and leaders that embraced failure for growth's sake. Growth's sake. And that's got to find its way into our training if we want to get after this. So a lot there. I'm gonna have to go back and listen to this and digest a lot of what you said. So I appreciate you having you on here. Wealth of knowledge, a lot of stuff to unpack here. I want to have you on here again. There's a couple other topics I want to broach with you. Any parting shots or any final comments you want to leave us with?
No, I just think that it's important to keep in mind that what we teach here at MCTOG isn't just how to do planning. It's basically how to be a tactics instructor. And I think that more people should try to come out here and be a part of it, because I think that's going to be, like I said, the thing that helps us with the next fight.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for listening. Look to have you back here very shortly with a new episode coming shortly. Out here.